Thank you so much for inviting us here today. Today's topic is so exciting. Hogan is really known for the dark side assessment. And so I'm so happy to be here talking with you about coaching the dark side. And hopefully today I'll give you some extra tips about how you can use the HDS to help your coaching become more effective and how to help leaders achieve their goals and become more effective at building up their teams. So my name is Krista Pederson. I am the Managing Director of Hogan Assessments Asia Pacific Markets, and I've been at Hogan this is actually my 12th year this year. So I've run around the block, but I've actually been in Asia probably longer than outside of Asia in my adult life. So I actually live and am based in China. Not too far from Bangkok. Actually, the flight is about an hour and a half away from Bangkok, but I'm so happy to be here. So today the agenda is talking about, can everyone see my slides? Maybe you can type yes or no in the chat. We'll be using the chat a little bit today to interact. So yes, great. Okay, so for today, we have a very full agenda. We're going to be talking a little bit about assessments and what is the dark side. I understand that most of you are Hogan certified. Could you actually type if you're Hogan certified? And if so, are you certified on the basic level or have you been Hogan certified on the advanced level? If you'll type that in the chat, that will be very helpful as well. But we'll talk a little bit about the dark side, about derailers and their impact on reputation. Good. I'm seeing some people are Hogan certified. Wonderful. We'll talk about the importance of strategic self-awareness and self-monitoring, and as you're coaching and giving people feedback, how you'll be able to coach around improving someone's self-awareness and how to help them improve their self-monitoring. And specifically coaching around triggers to avoid dark side behaviors. This is something that we actually don't teach in the workshop. So I see a lot of you have been Hogan certified, which is wonderful. But we'll also be going into some even more in-depth topics here beyond the certification. Great, we have advanced level for both interpretation and feedback. Wonderful. Finally, we'll end you today with some practical application and some success stories to show you specifically how people have used coaching the dark side themes to help their leaders become more successful. So this is a little plug. I think since most of you have been Hogan certified, I don't have to extol the wonders of why we should be using assessment for coaching. But actually, this is something that is quite a new concept for a lot of different coaches. In fact, we know that some coaching organizations discourage the use of assessments. But from Hogan's point of view, we really think it's important to have a baseline third-party piece of data that you can use to help act like a mirror to enhance the participant's self-awareness. And so from our perspective, we believe it increases coaching effectiveness. And again, the unique part about Hogan, we see that someone can't see the presentation. Let me see. Let me try moving sorry.
I can see. I'm not sure about others.
Is there anyone else that cannot see the presentation? If so, I might need to switch to the screen sharing mode.
Okay, could Mickey, Mickey can see. Yes, all right. Yeah.
Okay. I wonder, Ellen, I wonder if it's because she does not have Teams as part. Are you logging on the web? I saw there was a little note that said some people might not have access to all the features in Teams.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, we'll move on for now. Maybe you can try logging on off and logging in.
Yes.
Okay. And if you still have problems, we might switch to the sharing the actual website instead of sharing within the Teams. So we'll try that. Okay. So let us know once you've logged off and on again.
Yes.
So, okay.
Thank you, Krista. Yes.
Absolutely. So as I was saying, it's really important to use assessments from Hogan's perspective because we offer information on your reputation. And so even though you could use another assessment, of course, we love Hogan here. And the way that Hogan measures your personality is we're not measuring what you think of yourself. We're measuring your reputation or how other people view your behavior. And if you are doing executive coaching, especially at that high of a level, it can be very important to know an external perspective that isn't like a 360. 360s are great too, but they can have political bias as well. But if you're measuring reputation through Hogan personality assessments, you are getting some really solid information about how your personality is viewed by other people. And so one thing, because specifically we're talking about the dark side, we like to point out that the dark side or your derailers are the biggest reason for a negative reputation. And it's called the dark side because this is not the side of someone that is showing up every day. It's the aspect of someone that is coming out under certain times when you're not self-monitoring. And we'll talk a little bit more about what type of times those are in just a moment. I want to check in. Is there anyone else that can't see? Should I switch to sharing my page instead of actually using the Teams presentation? Ellen, are you still there? Are you still having a hard time seeing the presentation? Or is anyone else having a hard time seeing the presentation? I'll wait until someone chats me. If someone says they can't see it, then I'll switch to another version. Otherwise, I'll keep going. Sound good? Okay, so at Hogan, we talk about the bright side and the dark side. And of course, with the bright side of personality, we're looking at filtered behavior or your behavior on a day-to-day basis, the side that everyone's seeing the best of. But with the dark side, we're seeing personality that concerns unfiltered behavior. These are the behaviors that come out when you're not self-monitoring, when you're not filtering your behavior. And that a lot of times is when you're under stress and pressure. But of course, managers' dark side behavior erodes employee engagement. It's that unfiltered behavior where you're being, I would even say Dr. Hogan would argue that when you're being your authentic self, when you're being your true self, offering that unfiltered side of yourself, that causes problems. So for today, I think most people have been Hogan certified, so I won't spend too much time talking about this, but we are going to be focusing most on the HDS, which is the side that causes the most reputational damage, especially as a leader. So especially as a leader, it's really important to understand more about your derailers. So your Hogan derailers are behaviors that can potentially undermine or inhibit your performance. As a coach, it's really important to share that these behaviors can detract from your effectiveness. And of course, how do we define effectiveness at Hogan? It's building and maintaining a high-performing team. So, oh, okay, great. Everyone can see the slides now. Wonderful. Derailers are behaviors that can potentially undermine or get in the way of a leader's success. They detract from a leader's effectiveness. These are behaviors that have negative implications for your team, for the broader organization, and also for a leader's own reputation. These are behaviors that typically appear under stress, pressure, or when someone is complacent or too comfortable, essentially when you stop self-monitoring. So if you think about a new hire to the job, when you hire someone for the first 3 months, they're usually the best employee ever. They're showing their filtered behavior, the bright side. But after those first 3 months is when the stress adds on, the work adds on, when they start getting more comfortable at their job with their colleagues. And this is when we typically start to see that unfiltered behavior starting to emerge.
Just like after the honeymoon period.
Exactly.
After.
Exactly. The first 3 months of dating are great, and then you get into that
Yes.
6 to 12 months and you start
Yes.
seeing the cracks, right? And even more so as you get more and more comfortable. The other thing I'd like to point out too, Dr. Hogan has a great line. He says that power doesn't corrupt, power reveals. And so a lot of times the higher you go up in an organization, the more comfortable you are, the more power you have that people can't touch you. And so the more likely you are to exhibit these unfiltered behaviors. And so what exactly is the impact of the dark side derailers? Your derailers will distract you from your goals to get along and get ahead. They will slow down your progress in your career and as a leader, and essentially they will prevent you from succeeding long term. And so it's really important that, especially as we are coaching people and coaching these top leaders, that we start helping them realize how they can get ahead and stop these unfiltered behaviors from becoming a detriment to their success. And so today I'd like to present 2 ideas for how you can manage the dark side. And at Hogan, we tend to be very, very practical. We know that people exist in a real world. And we know that even though we can give you all of these ideas for how you can make people aware of their dark side and how you can manage these behaviors, there is one point that I'd like to share to you today, which is you can manage the dark side with a forgiveness credit. The second point is that, and this is the point we'll spend more time on, is you can manage it through strategic self-awareness and developing that as a coach. So let's first talk about this forgiveness credit. So we know, and all of you who've been certified, especially in the advanced certification workshops, we know that every dark side theme has some positive qualities. And being effective actually creates a forgiveness credit for you, so you can behave more poorly. And I'm saying this, I know this seems maybe a bit artificial, or it maybe seems surprising, but actually, if managers are more effective than ineffective, then staff will forgive their bad behavior up to a certain point. And so I think it's very important that we point this out, because we can talk about managing bad behaviors and talk about coaching and try to convince people that, managing your dark side is very important. But I think it's also very realistic to point out that some of our star performers do have these bad behaviors. And up to the certain point, if they are effective, even though they have bad behaviors, their teams, their managers, people around them will forgive them for their bad behavior up to a certain point. And that's key here. And this is why, of course, the higher your score on the HDS is, the more likely these bad behaviors will come out. There does get to be a certain point where your behavior becomes too toxic and it alienates your team. And it does, even if you're the best performer in the world, it will get in the way of your success. And so we're going to spend more time talking about the point 2, which is developing strategic self-awareness in our leaders to help them curve these bad behaviors so that it won't get in the way of their success, so they don't have to worry about using that forgiveness credit too much. And so what do we mean when we talk about strategic self-awareness? We mean really 3 things: understanding your own strengths and weaknesses, but also recognizing that you do not live in a silo. You don't live in a vacuum. You actually work with other people. And as a leader is leading teams. And so you also have to understand how your strengths and weaknesses compare to other people. And then doing something about the strengths, to be even more strong, but also doing something especially about the weaknesses and your derailers so that going forward, they won't be problematic. And why is this so important? It's because the point of coaching is to increase self-awareness. Research suggests leaders who are self-aware are more successful. They tend to seek feedback in multiple forms. They tend to think about the feedback and accept the feedback. They also act on it and consequently are more successful. Whereas on the opposite end, our research tells us that leaders who are not self-aware, the leaders who miss feedback messages, who ignore the feedback messages they do, or just write it off because they don't think it applies to them, they tend to be slow to change over time, and they tend to top out and fail. And we've seen this time and time again. If the leader fails, then there's the risk that the organization and the team will fail as well. And so it's really important that we are developing this strategic self-awareness in our leaders so that we can support not only their own success, but the success of their teams and the success of the broader organization. So it is important to understand why we should encourage people we coach to develop awareness around their weaknesses. And so ongoing feedback is crucial to enhancing one's strategic self-awareness. So again, as we're coaching, we're going to angle towards understanding someone's strengths and watch out points, understanding how these compare and how they affect to the team, and how the situation around the leader, the teams they're managing, the actual industry they're in, all of the situational factors are also important to understand. And then ultimately, your role as the coach is helping the coachee develop that self-awareness, and a lot of times forming a plan to help improve is the best way to support them in that. So we're going to focus on 3 components to coaching strategic self-awareness, and it is helping the coachee understand their reputation for the dark side characteristics so that they can actually avoid these derailers. The second point is really finding the triggers so that we can prevent these bad behaviors before they even start to happen, so that we can have that filter and keep that filter up. And then also developing strategies to control or even better to prevent this problematic behavior. So sometimes in order to bring attention to these problems, however, you do have to start with the strengths, because I don't know about you, but I've been in some coaching sessions where it's been very difficult to point out the weaknesses or the negative sides of these derailers, because they are negative, right? And they're potentially things that are viewed as very negative and bad behavior. And so sometimes it's good to start with the positive, because the dark side does have clear strengths. So you can see here are some ways that you can talk around these difficult conversations. So if someone is high and excitable, you can say, wow, you have a lot of passion and energy, right? And that's the great part about it. Don't lose that. But if you're easily frustrated, moody, and you have low persistence on something, this can cause problems with your team. They can get disillusioned. They can lose the focus. They won't understand why you keep on getting excited about something, then dropping it, right? Or for example, with someone who's bold, this one's a tough one, because we know people who are bold tend to be arrogant and not willing to admit that they're wrong. But if you describe them as courageous and having really strong confidence, that can be very positive, and that can have a positive effect on the team up to a certain point. And so starting out with the positives can sometimes be a foot in the door to helping our coachees understand more about how these positive behaviors can then potentially turn negative, and then have negative impacts on their teams if they're overused. So another important part of this is not looking at the derailers in a vacuum again, but understanding the context so that self-awareness becomes strategic. So strengths in one environment may be derailers in another. And so it's really important that you understand the context. And I'll give you an example of this. Someone who, again, is high on the bold scale and in certain environment is known as very confident, right? And showing that confidence and having a lot of willingness to try things, right? And to do things that maybe other people don't think that they'll accomplish. But in a situation where this leader needs to admit when they're wrong, in a situation where it actually requires a bit of humility, this can actually become a negative thing. So variable factors include the role that someone is. So you can consider the role that they have to do. If you are high and mischievous in an auditor's role, this may become very problematic, right? Or if you're excitable and you're an air traffic controller, this could also create some issues. So, but if you are high colorful and if you are supposed to be in the role of sales, that could actually be something that's very positive. Of course, you'll want to at times put more of a focus on the team, but considering the actual role that someone has to do can be very important in knowing whether or not this derailer is going to become really a high risk or not. Understanding their manager and the relationship with their manager, the organization, what the organization is doing, the culture at the organization. So for example, at an organization like Amazon, where it's very, very customer first, if you have someone that is super high on reserved, that might become problematic in a very warm, friendly, customer first type of environment. Of course, the individual, how they're interacting with their own team and the team they lead, the environment, and even we can say country culture, the culture in which you're working in. So, for example, we know that in China, where I'm at, actually leaders are typically a little bit higher on the bold scale. So someone who's high bold in China would be considered quite normal, and those behaviors might even be expected by their team. But when you have an American leader who is lower on the bold scale coming to China, they may not know the expectations of how a leader will behave. So understanding the country context is also very important. So, as a coach, if you take the time to understand the culture of the organization, the leaders in charge of evaluating performance, what it means for success in that role, and how the capabilities and culture of the team that person is leading may add or detract from success in the role, along with the broader context, you will be able to help your coachee become more strategic about the areas they should focus on to become more effective. So if you take the time to understand these as an individual, then you will gain more clarity on your own reputation and the impact that you can make in this role. And so we know that these contexts are always changing. In fact, the World Economic Forum said that about 25% of all jobs will change within the next 3 years. So please note that the situational context is the aspect that can and should be diagnosed by the professional discussing with the coachee or the key stakeholders involved. That is the aspect where you're going to need to do a little bit of communication before going into the coaching session. The HDS is a professional tool, and it is best practice to use an assessment for this, but you should never try to attempt to diagnose the HDS derailers on your own without the assessment data. That can lead to assumptions, and you don't want to do that. But the situational context is where you, as the professional, bring the derailers to life for this person, for your coachee. So again, don't speculate on someone's HDS derailers without validated data, but you can do interviews with the stakeholders and the person themselves to collect more information on this situational context. Okay, so why discuss the dark side derailers? Derailers are coping mechanisms that may go astray. And while some of these behaviors may help us in the short term, they ultimately damage both leader and team engagement and drive away people. But of course, we know that derailers aren't just functioning all the time. No one's highballed 100% of the time. These are negative behaviors that happen when we are not self-monitoring. Again, it's the unfiltered behavior that comes out when you feel either too comfortable or in many different situations. And so if we think about it with the landscape of, this is it with medicine, we know that preventative care is better than curative medicine. To prevent the problem is better than having to go back and make up for the problem. So with our HDS derailers, it's the same. It's much better to prevent these damaging behaviors from occurring in the first place than it would be to do the damaging behavior, with high bold, like refusing to admit you're wrong, alienating the team, and then having to go back and apologize and make up for it later. So how do we apply this preventative medicine here? We look at what triggers the negative behaviors in the first place. So what are triggers? Why should we care? Triggers are essentially a catalyst or stimuli that impacts our behavior. And so it takes self-awareness to understand what may trigger our negative behavior. And as a coach, it's really important that we're getting our coachees to think about, okay, what is the trigger? To ask what the trigger is and get them to prevent that behavior. So normally how the cycle goes is there's the trigger, and then there's the impulse to act and do something, and then there's the behavior. So for high excitable people, it might be the trigger. They feel really upset that something didn't go their way, and so then they yell at their team because they have that impulse, and then they just act on that impulse. Now, what we're trying to do here is add that third step of awareness so there's a choice whether or not to do the behavior. Because right now, in the normal cycle with HDS behaviors, it's just like you're not self-monitoring, it's just your natural inclination. So in order to break the cycle, let's become aware, let's help develop that awareness to give our coachees a choice to do something different with their behavior. And so how we can help do that is identifying the triggers for each, or helping our coachees identify those triggers for each behavior. So, for example, someone who's high and colorful. I am aware of my high colorful derailer, so I need to better control my tendency to be dramatic, to self-promote, to talk over people, to distract from what's going on in the meeting. So that's like a generally after you've gone through a Hogan certification workshop, you should be able to say, yes, someone that's high and colorful tends to be dramatic and self-promote, right? But here with coaching, let's be more specific. So for me, my high colorful often happens when I'm sitting in a meeting, I'm feeling super bored, and then I start becoming high colorful and making silly comments and distracting from the meeting. So I know that it's boredom. It's in the meeting when I start noticing I'm feeling so bored. And then instead of just automatically reacting and making comments that are distracting or trying to bring the attention on me, I can say, I need a strategy to redirect that idle energy when I feel bored. So instead of when I'm bored in a meeting, instead of automatically just saying a comment, now that I have awareness, I have the awareness that I'm feeling bored. Either I need to do something on the side so that I'm not so bored, or if I even feel the need, but I have this funny comment I want to make, let me write it down and tell my team later so that I don't become a distraction to the meeting. So again, it's that awareness about what's going on, helping people and our coaches become more aware so that we can stop the negative behaviors is what's important with triggers. So Hogan has a coaching network in the US that offers executive coaching based on Hogan and our assessments to many high-level executives. And so we actually did some focus groups to research what specifically may trigger some of these high-powered executives. And again, many people assume HDS derailers are just about behaving poorly under stress and pressure, but actually our focus groups found that it goes much more behind that. So the list here shows a number of different triggers, including interpersonal conflict, when an individual's values or rights are perceived to be violated, not respected, boredom, when they feel inexperienced, they approach a new situation and feel inadequate, and many other themes. So in the chat here, I know we have this list here of a lot of different triggers. In the chat, can you think of any other triggers that might cause negative behaviors? If you can think of any, can you put that in the chat here and I'll read them out if you can think of any other triggers. So here we have on our list, we have deadlines, so if someone has like a deadline and they want to get it perfect, if they're high and diligent, they may have difficulty and become even more micromanaging when they're stretching into a new role. That's a good one. That one, when you have a new role that you need to go into and it feels stressful and you're not quite sure what to do, that might be a trigger. Anything else? I already mentioned boredom, but novelty, again, sometimes novelty in a new role, in a different situation, going to a different country, dominating others. Yeah, the need for control. Ambiguity is another great one. So when you're not quite sure what to do, that might be a trigger. Uncertain situations. Great. Yeah, sometimes it's complacency. You are disengaged by what's going on, so you just let it all out. Again, if you're thinking about the triggers are triggers to what makes your behavior unfiltered, it could be a number of different things. But your role as the coach will be to help work with the coachee to kind of figure out what these triggers are. So urgent, something that's urgent. Yeah, something that a deadline, a sense of urgency. Environment and culture is a huge one, especially new environments, or even when you're in an environment that you're very comfortable in. If you've been working at an organization for a long time, that could also create, the willingness to be unfiltered more. Even trust, that's a positive thing, but trusting the team, maybe you're more willing to yell at people that you trust, right, with high excitable. Okay. So for this next section, I'll actually be sharing different examples and case studies of real coachees where we've worked with so that we can offer a more vivid picture of how we can coach people and their dark side derailers. Personal trauma is another one as well. That's a very good one. If you've had something happen to you before in the past, that could be a trigger that causes these derailers, because we know that these derailers sometimes are ways that you use to protect yourself. They're automatic, short-term strategies for protecting yourself and dealing with insecurity as well. So that's a great one. These are great. We need to add these to the list here. Okay. So before we go into the full case studies, we have a couple of smaller case studies to give you an example of how you can approach derailers with a coachee, especially when you're pulling in the situational context. So as we mentioned here before, HDS derailers could have some short-term benefits. We should take this into account when working with a coachee, but also help them work out where the negative behavior for the derailer also may be triggered. So let's first take this example of Eddie here on the slide. So Eddie took the Hogan Assessments, and as part of this, we know that he has a higher score on excitable. So Eddie is a high performer, but he also does demonstrate typical high excitable behaviors like emotional volatility. He has those high highs and low lows. He tends to raise his voice with team members, and then he pushes for projects, but then when it starts not going how he likes, he kind of drops it later on. So he is being asked to a coaching engagement because of his 2 direct reports, and they've complained to HR about his behavior. Eddie's manager, however, puts performance over any other quality in evaluating leaders. His manager also believes that great leaders are to be feared and not loved. So, in thinking about this example of Eddie, let's think about the context for Eddie. So, type in the chat what you think his risk of derailment is. Do you think it's low, moderate, or high in this context? So, again, he's a high performer who sometimes is viewed as disrespectful and intimidating by his team members, but his leader tends to believe that great leaders are feared and thinks Eddie is great. So with this context, do you think that Eddie's risk of derailment is low, moderate, or high? Can you type it in the chat? High? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other thoughts? In a context where we have tolerance for this type of behavior, right? His boss is tolerant it. Low. And so we have some contrasting. It depends on the organization. Well, we know that Eddie's organization, he has an 88 on his excitable, but his organization is pretty tolerant of Eddie's behavior, right? So also, if this is acceptable, then his derailment risk would be low. So another way to ask him this is, what may be some considerations for coaching him about his derailers? So Eddie is an interesting case, right? And this is actually not unusual. We see a lot of organizations that really reward Eddie type behavior. His leader might be ignoring his bad behavior with his team members if he is driving results for the organization. So if he is not being held accountable, he may not notice his negative impact on others or even care about his impact if he is getting the results he wants. So remember at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned the forgiveness tax. This is actually one example where the forgiveness tax may be coming into play with his leader, but this does not mean that Eddie's behavior is okay or that the forgiveness tax is an excuse for bad behavior forever, because clearly Eddie's behavior is starting to impact his team members and they're starting to complain. Okay, we have some thoughts for how to coach him. So what is the impact on your people of your style? That's a great question to ask Eddie if you're a coach, right? What about the psychological safety of the team members? Yeah, that's going to be an important one. So again, with derailers, short term, his behavior is helping him achieve goals and perform, right? But always with derailers is the long-term effect tends to be very alienating. It does cause problems with psychological safety, right? And so he may be achieving results in the short term, but if he's constantly alienating the team, if he is constantly, not using his behavior to create a psychologically dangerous situation for his team members, then this will affect other people's performance on his team and also ultimately his own performance. So the people he manages might quit or become disengaged. They're already complaining to HR. So ultimately, if Eddie wants to be successful in his career, he needs to develop self-awareness and start to change his negative behavior. And so I'm liking these questions where we're seeing what alternative styles might you try with your people? What might be the effect of these? Another one, if we think about how we were talking about triggers, with Eddie, we might want to work on what's triggering these behaviors, right? he might be getting rewarded for them in the short term, but long term, if he really does want to change these behaviors, we might want to talk to him about, okay, when you are acting excitable and you're raising your voice at people, when you're bullying people, essentially, what happens right before that? What's triggering this? Is it you're frustrated with people not doing what you want? Is it that lack of control? So there's a number of things that we could do to explore his triggers. But also, excitable behaviors at this organization may be tolerated more. And so it could be due to the company culture, the team culture, or even the cultural environment. Excitable is a moving away from scale that we tend to see in certain organizations' leadership. However, we do know that this can be problematic long term. So let's explore more of the triggers. I like these questions we're getting in. What rewards does he get, and what is the impact of the punishment he considers? Great. Okay. Moving on, we're going to look at Xiaoli, and Xiaoli is a little bit different than Eddie. She has great experience in process and project management, and she assessed on the Hogan Development Survey, and she scored a 91 on cautious. So she's very careful and double checks her work and the work of her direct reports because she wants to be as thorough as possible and avoid mistakes. Her organization is trying to become more competitive, and by direction of her manager, Xiaoli has hired a team of more innovative, creative, disruptive thinkers. So as you can see, Xiaoli's context is much more different than Eddie's. So Xiaoli has been pressured to hire younger, more creative, disruptive thinkers, and she has done this. So what do you think Xiaoli's risk of derailment is? You can type it in the chat. Do you think her risk is going to be low, moderate, or high? For Xiaoli, she's very careful, and yet she's now hired a team of creative, disruptive thinkers. So Xiaoli is now going to have to manage a team that's going to be fast-paced, innovative, want to get things done. You think Xiaoli's cautious is going to come into play? High. This is between team and her. The team ideates and she's process-oriented. Yep. I would agree. So if we compare her to Eddie even, Eddie's environment, they accommodated his negative behaviors as long as he was performing, with the forgiveness tax. It kind of worked for Eddie a little bit, although long-term we still acknowledge there's problems. But Xiaoli's environment completely changed and created the potential problem for her derailer of cautious to become an even bigger problem, because creative disruptive types tend to revolt against too much oversight. They need room to create and innovate. And if Xiaoli isn't careful, her high cautious scale will cause problems between her and her team. Actually, this is a typical situation that we tend to see. And in situations like that, we know that a lot of times the creative types either resign or get fired. They're too disruptive. And that is actually problematic for the long-term strategy of the organization. I see, Ellen, you're saying that she's going to be out of her depth and people moving quickly, and so she's very likely to display cautious. Yeah, she's going to be completely, putting the brakes on this team that's wanting to push forward. So really, self-awareness will be very important for Xiaoli to succeed in this role. She may view her tendencies to think through every decision and double check all of the work as very positive. But as her coach, I would work with her to help her understand how this behavior could be stifling and limit creativity for her new team members, and helping her walk through scenarios that might trigger her need for thoroughness may be important. It also seems she was extra careful when she is unsure about if the work will be correct. So for her, the trigger may be that ambiguity in the work. And so I would work with her to confirm that theory, and I would also plan some strategies to help her stay more hands-off, to allow her team to have more leeway in trying some new things. And there may be some things that she needs to jump in and have more careful control over, but let's talk about what those things are. And then working with her to determine the areas and ways she can take risks will be important to prevent that long-term performance issues for both her and her team, right? So these maybe are a bunch of like ideators, implementers, and she's just being very careful. You're absolutely right. So for Xiaoli, this is one area where it's very clear what we need to work with her on. We know that not every case is as clear as this, but But it is important to start looking at, the triggers. And here we have outlined a process for helping our coachees avoid these dark side behaviors. And the first point is to assess what these behaviors might be. That's very obvious. And that's what most of us have already done. You've taken the Hogan Assessments. So of course, assessment offers a great map of someone's personality. And as the coach, understanding the reputation will help you know how to coach around the behaviors. And then for the HDS derailers, it's best practice to offer HDS alongside of the HPI at the very least. And so you may diagnose the situational context alongside of the participant to help understand more about the overall context. So offering this data will help the participant become more self-aware about the reputation, which is point 2. So if the participant understands about their reputation as the coach, you can start bringing in situational context to further enhance the understanding of how their reputation plays out in their day-to-day workplace with the situation that they're working in. And this will be very key for step 3 of identifying the triggers. So work with the coachee to become more specific about when and why these behaviors occur so you can move to step 4. And step 4 is all about working with the coachee to offer real actionable steps to prevent derailers from emerging, thereby preventing their reputation becoming damaged by the dark side behaviors. So it's essentially working with them to put up those filters when they know it's a risk for having that unfiltered behavior. So next, I'm going to walk with you a small case study of how we did this process. And this was an executive director, and he had aspirations for a VP role. This was in the US. He was working for a US company, and he came from Latin America. So he actually came from a different culture. And his dark side risks were bold and imaginative. We also collected some feedback from his 360, and in his 360, it said, you don't listen enough, you come in with all the answers, you think you know best, which of course, this feedback, this negative feedback is all coming from those dark side risks, right? That's exactly mapping to bold and imaginative, someone who comes in with knowing everything and also all the answers and thinking they know best. That's exactly bold and imaginative, right? So in talking with him more, we labeled out some triggers. So some of the triggers included interpersonal conflict. So when he had conflict with especially stakeholders, people he's trying to impress, people on his team that could make an influence on what he was going through, that was a problem. Also, he sometimes felt that working in a different culture, especially with people he didn't know, made him dig in a bit more. He felt a bit insecure. And when he was feeling insecure, he felt the need to express himself even more. And then finally, the third trigger is when he knew what outcome he wanted to have, and when he knew how exactly he wanted to get there, he was less willing to listen to others. He wanted to maintain control. And when he felt like other people were stepping in and help and losing that sense of control is when the bold and imaginative behaviors would start coming out, and he'd dominate people. He wouldn't let them talk. He would share his ideas, and he just wouldn't let anyone else have a say. So working with him, we worked to anticipate these triggers. So whenever there was interpersonal conflict, we were working with him to plan for these upcoming interactions. When we knew there was going to be some conflict or differences of ideas, when we knew he'd be working with an unfamiliar culture, with an unfamiliar team, and we knew there would be problems because what he was thinking might be different or come into challenge from other teams, we worked with him to plan for that. So thinking about his upcoming meetings, presentations, and discussions, we talked with him about who specifically he will be interacting with. We talked about potentially thinking about their agenda because his tendency was only to think about his agenda, what he wanted from the meeting. So actually getting him to take a step back before going into the meeting and thinking about what other people might want helped him to get into a different frame of mind. Also helping him think about how other people's perspective might differ from his was very important. So finally, we helped him plan for desired outcomes. So beforehand, we helped him rehearse the message, anticipate impact and resistant, and we worked with him to let others speak first and versus him taking the lead. He would also in meetings would be very dominant and leaning forward and trying to take control even with his own body language. So for him, it was very important that we said, take a sit down, lean back, make sure you're having an open body language so that you're not just like automatically in that fight or flight mode, right? So actually taking a deep breath, having him sit back was very important for helping him become more open, even seem more open to the people he was meeting with. And then, of course, helping him anticipate triggers within a meeting that could lead to forgetting that situational awareness. And another big strategy that we used for this coachee was we asked him to have a trusted colleague observe during some meetings or presentations. Beforehand, we told him to discuss with his partner ahead of time what to look for. So when his wording or tone or phrasing became too authoritarian or too forceful, when his body language started getting tense, make note of that. In some of the meetings, the first meeting was more of a feedback session. Some of the meetings we actually suggested that this person maybe give a touch their nose, or maybe give him a text and have it vibrate on his phone or on his wristwatch that was connected to his phone, so he would remember, I'm starting to get triggered. I need to take a step back and relax. And so actually having that trusted person in the room gave him a really good third party observation of his own behavior, and it helped him take the feedback and be able to, in future meetings, plan so that he wasn't as triggered and his HDS derailers weren't coming out as much, so he could control it better. And then finally, having him reflect on the behavior after a meeting, even if it went poorly, having him reflect and being able to take a step back and consider helped him going forward in the meetings. And so for this team member, eventually it really did help, and his next 360 showed a lot of improvement from that. So that was an example, actually, the high, bold, and high, colorful. That was an example from the moving against people scales. I know we want to leave some time for Q&A, so we have just a couple more quick examples. One is from the moving away from scales, so with skeptical and cautious. We did a coaching session with a female vice president of a global multinational healthcare. She was French, she was 50 years old, and she was receiving constructive feedback from others about, she actually was up for a role, a promotion. Okay. And so she had some feedback that she was not very engaging or empowering of her direct reports and peers, and she was not modeling a community of learning. So she was, again, her derailers were clearly coming out. She was very skeptical of people. She was not helping have that psychological safety. And so her dark side triggers were receiving feedback from others, and then politically maneuvering of peers and seniors. So in working with her, we made some adjustments to avoid that dark side emerging. And so with her, she deliberately practiced a communication style of conscious inclusion of others. So instead of immediately questioning them or questioning their motives, she became more open and tried to include others. She slowed down her pace when managing meetings and her cadence when speaking with others. And then she also tried and proactively started delegating more and empowering her direct reports more and giving them more clear performance and guidelines. And so after 9 months of executive coaching, working with her on the triggers, working with her to stop her derailers of skeptical and cautious, she was actually promoted to a senior vice president of global markets. So that was a success case. Now, there was one other case that I wanted to share with the moving towards people cluster. And this one is quite interesting because this one was a Japanese citizen. She recently graduated from her MBA, and she was a first year onboarding with a global pharmaceutical multinational company. And she was part of their high potential program. However, her managers and her peers were expressing concern that the candidate was not asserting her point of view with confidence. She wasn't involving, she wasn't empowering, she wasn't acting very leader-like. And if you looked at her 2 scales, she was high on diligent and dutiful. And so for her in particular, she had a lot of self-doubt, and she was very afraid of making mistakes. And she even had critical perfectionism of her own self, but also of her team members. And so in working with her and looking at her triggers and helping coach around her dark side, we actually worked with her to ask peers and managers for feedback when they observed self-doubt and being excluded, and to have her practice that culture of feedback. She was so worried that people would be critical of her, and she was actually often surprised because the feedback that she got wasn't only negative. A lot of the feedback was positive, and some was actually quite helpful for her success. And then we also worked with her to deliberately practice being positive rather than being, that high diligent, very critical micromanager with her peers and her manager. And then we also, based on some other feedback, we enrolled her in an emotional intelligence workshop with a focus on increasing her own self-confidence and self-regulation of emotions. And after 12 months of this executive coaching engagement, she achieved a combination of fully meets expectations of the onboarding initiative, and her role expanded to include management of a team of direct reports as part of that high potential program. So those are kind of the examples I have today. I know we have a lot more resources that you can use if you're interested in learning more. We have a YouTube overview of the HDS, which is kind of fun. We have a Hogan Dark Side website. Of course, the ATS consulting team is very experienced, and they're experts in interpreting the dark side. We also even have a Coaching the Dark Side book. If you're more interested more, you can reach out to JJ and Zeep to learn about how you can get your hands on that book. And so if you have any Q&A, please feel free to type it in the question and answer box or in the chat, or you can come off of mute. So we'll leave time for Q&A.